The sun bleached the sky to a hazy white, and the air shimmered over the cracked alkali flats like a fever dream. From his vantage point on the low ridge, Jack Callahan watched the stagecoach lumber along the dusty trail below, a fragile beetle crawling across a vast, indifferent anvil. For 5 years this had been his life, watching waiting, tending to the quiet rhythms of his small ranch on the outskirts of Redemption Gulch. For 5 years he had successfully convinced himself that the man he used to be, U.S. Marshal Callahan, a name once spoken with equal parts fear and respect, was buried as deep as the ghosts that haunted his sleep. The shot echoed sharp and clean, a sound that ripped through the placid afternoon and straight into Jack's soul. It wasn't the clumsy crack of a prospector's rifle, but the precise report of a high-caliber Sharps. The lead horse screamed and stumbled, its legs tangling in the traces, sending the whole team into a chaotic pileup. The coach slewed sideways, groaning like a dying beast, before settling in a cloud of its own dust. 4 riders emerged from a dry wash, where they'd been concealed, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that spoke of long practice. 3 fanned out to cover the perimeter, while their leader dismounted. He was a tall man dressed in a tailored black coat that seemed to absorb the punishing sunlight without complaint. He moved not with the swagger of a common highwayman, but with the unhurried confidence of a surgeon approaching an operating table. This was Silas Vance. Jack knew the name. Everyone in the territory did. Vance was a new breed of outlaw, not just violent, but intelligent, methodical, and cruel in a way that felt personal. Jack's hand of its own accord drifted to the empty space on his hip where his Colt Peacemaker had once lived. Now there was only worn denim. He was a rancher, not a lawman. This was not his fight. He stayed low behind the scrub brush, a silent, unwilling witness. The coach door flew open, and a portly drummer was unceremoniously hauled out, followed by a woman clutching her reticule. The driver and shotgun guard already stood with their hands raised, faces pale with terror. Silas Vance ignored them all. His gaze settled on the last passenger, to emerge a man in his late 60s, with a kind, weathered face and a shock of white hair. Jebediah Croft, an old prospector who'd struck a modest claim years back. He was a friend, one of the few men in Redemption Gulch who treated Jack not as a legend or a specter, but simply as a neighbor. Jebediah Vance said, his voice calm and conversational, carrying clearly in the still air. "It has been a long time." Jebediah swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "Vance, I have nothing you'd want. Just a few dollars." "Oh, I think you do," Vance replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. It did not reach his cold, dark eyes. He stepped forward and, without a change in expression, drew a silver-inlaid revolver. The drummer cried out. The woman stifled a scream. The shot was deafeningly loud. Jebediah crumpled to the ground without a sound, a dark stain spreading across the chest of his homespun shirt. The other passengers froze in horror. Vance paid them no mind. He knelt beside Jebediah's body, his movements precise. He reached into the dead man's vest pocket and pulled out a chain. Dangling from the end of it was a small, ornate silver locket. Vance examined it for a moment, then tucked it into his own coat. He stood, his gaze sweeping over the terrified survivors. "The strongbox, if you please. And your personal effects? A toll for your continued existence." As his men went about their grim work, Vance paused. He looked around, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges, the silent, watchful landscape. For a heartbeat, Jack felt as if those cold eyes locked directly onto his hiding place. A chill entirely unrelated to the desert heat traced its way down his spine. Vance then mounted his horse, gave a curt nod to his men, and they rode off, disappearing back into the shimmering heat as quickly as they had appeared. They left behind a stalled coach, 3 traumatized survivors, and the still cooling body of an old man in the dust. Jack remained frozen, and the image of the silver locket burned into his mind. It was oval-shaped with intricate scrollwork etched around its edge. He knew that locket. He had held it once, its weight a terrible burden in the palm of his hand, slick with blood that was not its owner's. The memory, walled off for 5 long years, shattered its prison. The smell of gunpowder and pine. A cabin nestled deep in the Colorado mountains. It was supposed to be a simple arrest, a counterfeiter named Caleb Vance. But the informant was wrong. Caleb wasn't a meek forger. He was a desperate man with a wife and young son inside. When Jack and his deputies stormed the cabin, Caleb came out firing. A stray shot from Jack's own gun went wide, striking the woman as she ran from the doorway. She fell, the silver locket flying from her hand to land in the snow. Caleb had screamed a sound of pure animal agony and charged blindly into the deputies' guns. Jack knelt by the woman, pressing his hand to the wound, but it was too late. Her dying eyes stared at nothing, and in his hand he held the locket he had picked up from the snow. It was still warm. The sound of sobbing from the road below pulled Jack back to the present. The woman was kneeling by Jebediah's body. The world came rushing back in a wave of heat and buzzing flies. Silas Vance was Caleb's younger brother. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. And the blood of Jebediah Croft was just the ink it was written in. Jack slowly rose to his feet, the quiet life he had so carefully constructed crumbling around him like sun-baked clay. His past had found him, and it wore a black coat and a cold, knowing smile. Redemption Gulch was a town holding its breath. It clung to the edge of the desert, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, empty landscape. The promise of the coming railroad was the only thing keeping it alive, a promise that felt more distant with each passing day. The saloon was too quiet, the general store too empty, and the sheriff's office felt more like a hospice for the law than a bastion of it. Sheriff Brody looked up as Jack Callahan pushed through the door. Brody was a man made of leather and gristle. His face a roadmap of 60 hard years. A tin star was pinned to his worn vest, but the authority had long since faded from his eyes, replaced by a permanent weariness. His deputy Miller, a young man barely out of his teens with an earnest face and an ill-fitting uniform, snapped to attention. Jack Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured you'd be by?" The stage just limped in. "I saw it happen." Brody Jack said, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears. He kept it low for the sheriff's ears only. It was Silas Vance. Brody's face sagged. "Vance. Lord have mercy. We heard he was in the territory." "He killed Jebediah Croft." Jack continued the words, tasting like ash. "Shot him down in cold blood." Deputy Miller, who had been listening with rapt attention, stepped forward. But why the strongbox only had a few $100s? Jebediah didn't have a pot to. "He didn't kill him for money," Jack cut in, his gaze fixed on Brody. "He took something. A silver locket." Brody's eyes, rheumy and tired, narrowed with a flicker of old intelligence. He knew Jack. He knew there were parts of Jack's past that were best left undisturbed. He saw the look on his friend's face and understood this went deeper than a simple stagecoach robbery. "It was a message, wasn't it?" Jack Brody asked quietly. Jack didn't answer directly. He's not just an outlaw, Brody. He's hunting. And his reasons are his own. "We have to form a posse." Sheriff Miller declared, his voice full of youthful fire. "We can't let him get away with murdering a citizen in broad daylight. We can track them." "Track Vance?" Brody scoffed, shaking his head. "Son, you don't track Silas Vance. He's a ghost with a rifle. He decides when and where he's found. A posse would be a suicide ride, and I'm not sending the good men of this town to their graves. So we do nothing, Miller protested aghast. We report it to the territorial marshals and pray they send someone before Vance decides to burn this whole town down for sport. Brody said, the defeat in his voice a palpable thing. He looked at Jack, a silent plea in his eyes. Unless you've got a better idea. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Are you back, Marshal? I'm a rancher now. Jack said the words, a shield he no longer believed in. He turned and left the office, the hot sun feeling like a judgment. His steps led him, as they often did in times of trouble, to the small clapboard building with the neatly painted sign, Dr. E. Vance. He stopped. The name on the sign was a cruel coincidence, one they had both learned to live with. Inside, Eliza was sterilizing instruments, the sharp, clean smell of carbolic acid, a stark contrast to the dust and decay of the town. Eliza was a woman of quiet strength, her hands as skilled at setting a bone as they were at tending her small garden. She and Jack shared a history that was a tapestry of unspoken grief. She was the widow of Jack's former deputy, Ben, who had died in that same disastrous raid 5 years ago. They had come to Redemption Gulch together, two broken people seeking a place quiet enough to heal. But their shared past was a ghost that always sat between them. She looked up as he entered, her intelligent eyes taking in his tense posture, the darkness in his expression. Jack, I heard about the stage, and about Jebediah. Vance did it, Eliza. She wiped her hands on a clean cloth, her movements calm and deliberate. I know. You know, the name Jack, Silas Vance. He was Caleb Vance's younger brother. I remembered it from the trial papers, the ones you could never bring yourself to read. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of compassion and old familiar pain. He's come for you, hasn't he? He's come for what he calls justice. Jack corrected, his voice tight. Jebediah was on the jury that cleared me in the inquiry. He called it a justifiable shooting. The blood drained from Eliza's face. The implications settled over them, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just about Jack. Vance wasn't just coming for the man who pulled the trigger. He was coming for the system that had absolved him. He was coming for the town that had given him sanctuary. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack looked at his hands. For 5 years they had been the hands of a rancher, calloused, steady, useful. But he could still feel the phantom weight of his Colt, the muscle memory of the draw. He could still feel the cold weight of that silver locket. I don't know, he admitted. But I can't stand by and watch him tear this town apart to get to me. He left her clinic and walked through the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch. He saw the fear in the faces of the townspeople, the way they hurried inside, barring their doors. He saw Deputy Miller practicing his draw in the alley beside the sheriff's office, his movements earnest but clumsy. He saw Sheriff Brody standing on the boardwalk, staring out at the endless desert as if daring his own mortality to ride in on the next breeze. This was his town now. These were his people. He had come here seeking redemption, but he had only brought damnation to their doorstep. The quiet life was over. The ghost of Marshal Callahan was stirring, and the debt he owed for that day in the mountains was finally coming due. Days bled into a week, each one hotter and more tense than the last. A suffocating quiet settled over Redemption Gulch. The railroad survey crew packed up and left, citing the hostile situation. The circuit judge postponed his visit. The town was an island, and Silas Vance was the shark circling in the water. There were no more attacks, no more sightings, but his presence was felt in every shadow, every gust of wind that rattled a loose shutter. Jack fell back into the old rhythms of the hunt, not with a badge, but with the grim patience of a man who knew his enemy. He rode the perimeter of the valley not looking for Vance, but for his signs. He found them. A series of small, seemingly random acts of sabotage. A rancher's well poisoned, not enough to kill the stock, just enough to make them sick. A section of track for the new rail line, pried up and bent a week's worth of work destroyed. At each site, tucked into a fence post or under a rock, Jack found a single black raven's feather. It was Vance's signature, a calling card left for an audience of one. Jack knew what Vance was doing. He was testing the fences, gauging the town's response, sowing fear and discord. He was dismantling Redemption Gulch piece by piece psychologically before he ever fired another shot into its streets. Sheriff Brody watched Jack with a kind of weary resignation. He didn't ask questions when Jack brought him the feathers. He just nodded his tired eyes, saying what his mouth wouldn't. "This is your fight. I'm just here to sweep up the pieces." Deputy Miller, however, was a bundle of frustrated energy. He saw Jack's quiet patrols as inaction. "We should be out there, Mr. Callahan," he argued one evening in the sheriff's office, his voice cracking with impatience. "Actively hunting him, setting traps, not just waiting for him to make a move." "He is making a move," son, Jack said, cleaning his newly reacquired Colt Peacemaker on Brody's desk. The familiar weight of it in his hands felt both comforting and terrible. "He's playing chess. You want to play checkers? You'll be off the board before you know it." With all due respect, Sir Miller pressed his face flushed. "The law isn't a game." "To him, it is," Jack countered, his voice flat. "And he's been planning his moves for 5 years. He knows every rule and he's ready to break them all. Are you?" Miller had no answer. He retreated to his paperwork, his ambition clashing painfully with his inexperience. Jack's investigation led him to the town archives, a dusty, neglected room in the back of the land registrar's office. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, just a pattern, a connection between Vance's seemingly random acts. He started with Jebediah Croft. The old prospector had been a juror at Jack's inquiry. But who else? Jack spent hours poring over the brittle yellowed pages of the territorial court records. The names of the other 11 jurors were there. He cross-referenced them with the town census. 3 were dead of natural causes. 5 had moved on. 4, including Jebediah, were still in or around Redemption Gulch. 1 was a rancher named Peterson, whose well had been poisoned. Another was a man named Gable, and who had been the foreman of the railroad crew that had just pulled out. The last was the town's registrar himself, a meek, balding man named Elias Thorne, who was now sweating nervously as Jack stood before him. "The feathers," Jack Brody said later that evening as they sat in the quiet office, a single lantern pushing back the shadows. "Peterson's well, Gable's rail line. He's not just sending you a message. He's picking off the jury, one by one. Not killing them, just ruining them, taking away what they value." "He's showing me he can," Jack said. "He's demonstrating his reach. It's a prelude." The quiet of the evening was broken by the sound of running feet and a panicked shout. "Fire! The registrar's office is on fire." Jack and Brody were out the door in an instant. The back of the land office was engulfed in flames, the dry timber catching with terrifying speed. A volunteer bucket brigade was already forming, but their efforts were feeble against the roaring blaze. Elias Thorne stood in the street, his face streaked with soot and tears, watching his life's work turn to ash. "My records," he sobbed. "Everything gone." Jack grabbed Thorne by the shoulders. "Elias, what did he take?" He didn't take anything. It went up so fast." But Jack knew better. Arson was a blunt instrument. Vance was surgical. Jack pushed past the onlookers and circled around to the alley behind the burning building. The back window was smashed. Inside, the fire raged, But near the window, a large, heavy ledger lay open on the floor, miraculously spared from the worst of the flames. He wrapped his hand in his jacket sleeve, broke away the remaining shards of glass, and pulled it out. It was the Maine County Land Deed Registry. Several pages had been torn out. As Jack scanned the remaining entries, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The missing pages weren't random. They corresponded to the original land grants for the entire valley, the founding parcels of what would become Redemption Gulch. Later, as the fire smoldered, casting a hellish glow over the town, Jack stood with Brody and a shaken Deputy Miller in the wreckage. Miller found it first tucked under the corner of the scorched ledger. Jack had saved a single black raven's feather. He burned the place down as a diversion, Miller said, the realization dawning on his face, to cover the theft of those pages. But why Jack, Brody asked, looking at the gutted building. What in God's name does Silas Vance want with a bunch of 50-year-old land deeds? The question hung in the smoky air. Everyone in the territory thought Vance was after the railroad payroll, a prize that would make him a legend. They were all looking one way, expecting a classic Western showdown over a fortune. But they were wrong. The midday robbery, the targeted harassment, the fire, it wasn't about money. It was about something else entirely. Something buried in the town's past. I don't know, Jack said, staring into the dying embers. But he's not after the railroad. He's after the town itself. The game had changed. This was no longer just a manhunt. It was a mystery. And to understand Silas Vance's motive, Jack knew he would have to dig up not only the town's history, but the one ghost he had tried hardest to bury his own. The theft of the land deeds shifted the weight of fear in Redemption Gulch. It was no longer the sharp, immediate terror of a gunslinger, but a creeping, insidious dread. Vance wasn't just a threat to their lives. He was a threat to their very existence, to the legitimacy of the ground beneath their feet. Jack Callahan became a man obsessed. He spent his days in the smoky shell of the registrar's office, sifting through what few records had survived his nights, poring over the salvaged ledger by lamplight. He was looking for a common thread, a link between the names on the stolen deeds and the event that had brought Vance to his doorstep, the raid on his brother's cabin. Eliza brought him food, her presence a silent offering of support. She would watch him work, his face grim in the flickering light, and see the marshal she once knew resurfacing, but older, sadder, and more determined. "You can't carry this all yourself, Jack," she said one night, placing a plate of stew on the table beside him. "It's my burden to carry," he replied without looking up from a faded map. "I brought him here. You brought a man to justice. His brother chose to walk a different path. Ben always said you saw the world in black and white, but sometimes, Jack, things are just gray." "Gray gets people killed," he muttered, the memory of her husband's death a fresh wound. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Deputy Miller, eager to prove his worth, had been cross-referencing the stolen deed numbers with old tax rolls saved from the fire. "Mr. Callahan," he said, approaching Jack with a sheaf of papers, his voice tight with excitement. "I think I found something. The original 5 land grants for this valley, the ones corresponding to the pages Vance stole, they weren't sold to settlers. They were granted by the territorial government." Granted for what, Jack asked, his attention piqued. "For services rendered," Miller said, pointing to a line of spidery script. "To the 5 founding members of the Verde Valley Regulators." Jack went still. The Verde Valley Regulators, a name from the territory's bloody past. They weren't lawmen. They were a government-sanctioned vigilante posse from 30 years ago, tasked with clearing the valley of hostiles to make way for settlement. Their methods were notoriously brutal and effective. They had been rewarded for their work with vast tracts of the very land they had pacified. "Get me the muster roll for that posse," Jack said, a dark suspicion beginning to form. It took Miller another day of digging, but he found it. A list of 5 names. As Jack read them, the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. The first name was Jebediah Croft's father, the second Peterson's grandfather, the third Gable's, the fourth Elias Thorne's, and the fifth. The fifth was a man named Angus Callahan, Jack's father. The world tilted on its axis. His own father, a man Jack had only known as a stern, hard-working rancher, had been one of the regulators. The land his ranch was on the very ground he had tried to build a peaceful life upon was a reward for a past he knew nothing about. "What is it?" Sheriff Brody asked, seeing the look on Jack's face. It was never about the jury, Jack said, his voice hollow. Jebediah Peterson Gable Thorne. Vance wasn't targeting them. He was targeting their names, their legacy. It's about the founding of this town. But why the regulators' violent history was hardly a secret. What was Vance trying to uncover? The answer lay buried with the ghosts of the past. Jack knew he had to find it before Vance did. His investigation took a more personal turn. He rode out to the old family ranch, to the small dilapidated shed where his father had kept his personal effects. He hadn't been inside in years. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. In a locked footlocker beneath a pile of moldering blankets, he found it his father's journal. The entries were short, practical, and written in his father's spare, unforgiving hand. Most were about crops, cattle, and weather. But as Jack flipped toward the entries from 30 years ago, the tone changed. He wrote of the regulators, of the hard, bloody work of taming the valley, and then one entry dated the year the posse was disbanded made Jack's blood run cold. October 10th. The job is done, but the secret is a heavy stone. We found silver in the North Canyon, a rich vein. Our payment was the land, but the silver was a bonus we kept for ourselves. We swore an oath. The map is divided in 5 one piece for each of us. A treasure for our sons, a foundation for the future. May God forgive us for the blood we spilled to get it. It all made sense. The land grants the systematic targeting of the founding families. Vance wasn't after justice for his brother's wife. He was after a lost silver mine. The story of the avenging brother was a brilliant, terrifying facade. But how did Silas Vance know about it? The answer came to him in a flash of memory. Caleb Vance, the counterfeiter. He wasn't just a forger. His specialty was maps. He had likely been hired by one of the descendants of the regulators to recreate a lost piece of the map, stumbled upon the bigger secret, and decided to claim it for himself. When he was killed, the secret must have passed to his brother. The silver locket it must have held one of the map pieces. Jebediah's father had passed it to him as secret inheritance. Vance had been collecting the pieces. Jack was the last one. As if summoned by the revelation, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, a black silhouette against the blood-red sunset. The rider carried a white flag of truce. It was one of Vance's men. He stopped 100 yards from the sheriff's office and left a canvas sack on the ground before retreating. Deputy Miller cautiously retrieved it. Inside was not a threat, but a collection of items: Peterson's prize-winning pocket watch, Gable's silver belt buckle, Thorne's spectacles, and a letter addressed to Jack. Callahan. You are a smarter man than I anticipated. You see now that this is not about simple revenge. It is about an inheritance. Your father and his cohorts built this town on a foundation of theft and blood, and you built your life on a lie. They stole a fortune, and I intend to reclaim it. I have 4 pieces of the map. The locket Jebediah so foolishly carried was the first. The others were persuaded from their owners. You have the last piece. I know you do. Your father was not a man to leave such things to chance. Meet me at dawn 2 days from now at the old San Augustine mission in the Sand Flats. Come alone with your piece of the map. We will settle this once and for all. If you do not, I will burn Redemption Gulch to the ground, starting with the good doctor's clinic. I know of your affection for the widow. It would be a shame to see it tested by fire. Oh, do not mistake this for a negotiation. It is a summons. S.V. Tucked into the letter was a single raven's feather. The threat against Eliza was a cold blade to Jack's throat. Vance had him. He had anticipated his every move, exploited his every weakness. Jack looked at Brody, whose face was a mask of grim resolve. "You're not going alone," the old sheriff said. "He'll kill her if I don't," Jack countered. "He'll kill you if you do." Miller chimed in, his youthful fear warring with a newfound courage. There has to be another way. But Jack knew there wasn't. Vance had turned the board around, forcing Jack to come to him. The final move was at hand, not in the dusty streets of the town he sought to protect, but in the crumbling ruins of a forgotten church, a place of fallen gods and final reckonings. In his father's journal, tucked between the last 2 pages, was a brittle yellowed piece of parchment, a map fragment showing a canyon and a series of cryptic symbols. The last piece, the key to everything. The wind began its assault just before dawn, a low, mournful howl that swept across the alkali flats, picking up sand and grit until the air itself was a roiling brown curtain. The San Augustine mission materialized from the storm like a skeletal ghost, its bell tower a jagged tooth against the churning sky. It was a place of profound decay, its adobe walls crumbling its holy ground, long since reclaimed by the desert. Jack rode into the mission's courtyard and the wind tearing at his duster. He dismounted, his boots crunching on sand and broken roof tiles. The place was unnervingly quiet, save for the shrieking wind. He was alone, just as Vance had demanded. "You're punctual, Marshal," Silas Vance's voice echoed from the shadowed archway of the chapel. "I appreciate that in a man." Vance stepped out into the maelstrom. He was immaculate as always, his black coat barely disturbed by the gale. He held his silver inlaid revolver loosely in his hand. "The map piece, if you please." "First you let him go," Jack said, his voice level, his eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of a trap. Vance smiled. "Him." From the darkness behind Vance, 2 of his men emerged, dragging a bound and gagged figure between them. It was Deputy Miller. His uniform was torn, his face bruised, but his eyes were wide and defiant. They shoved him to his knees in the center of the courtyard. "The boy was sniffing around my camp," Vance said conversationally. "He has courage, I'll grant him that. A foolish, pointless courage, but courage nonetheless. He will serve as our insurance." The sandstorm intensified, the wind screaming through the broken arches. Visibility was dropping to near zero. The mission's crumbling structure groaned under the strain, sending dust and pebbles raining down from above. "The map, Callahan," and Vance repeated, his voice rising above the storm. "Or the boy's ambition dies here in the dust." Jack reached into his coat and pulled out the fragment of parchment. He held it up. "Here. Now let him go." "Toss it here," Vance commanded. Jack knew it was a fool's bargain. The moment Vance had the map, they were both dead. He had to change the equation. This mission won't survive this storm. The main bell tower is unstable. We'll all be buried in here if we don't hurry. A flair for the dramatic, Vance chuckled. "I always heard that about you." He gestured with his gun. "The map." Jack took a step forward, then another. "The secret died with my father and his friends. It should stay buried." "Nothing stays buried forever, Marshal. Not secrets, not sins, and certainly not a river of silver." As Jack drew closer, he saw it. the look in Vance's eyes. It wasn't just greed. It was something deeper, something colder. It was a burning personal hatred that the promise of a silver mine alone could not explain. This was never about the silver, was it? Jack said, the pieces finally falling into place. The mine is real, but it's not your prize. It's just the bait. The deeds, the map. It was all an elaborate trap to get me here. To get me alone. Vance's smile widened a chilling, predatory expression. 5 years, Callahan. 5 years I have thought about this moment. 5 years since you murdered my family. Your brother fired first, Jack stated, his voice hard. His wife. It was an accident. A tragedy. A tragedy, Vance's voice dripped with venom. You call the execution of an innocent woman a tragedy. You and your pack of government-sanctioned killers stormed his home. My brother was a cartographer, a scholar, not some hardened outlaw. He was wanted for counterfeiting territorial bonds, Jack said. A crime of desperation, Vance roared, his composure finally cracking. He was trying to build a life for his family, a life your civilization had no place for. And you, the great Marshal Callahan, were cleared by a jury of your own kind. Your friends. The sons of murderers and thieves who founded this pathetic town. Justice. There is no justice in your world. There is only power. A large section of the bell tower's facade cracked and fell into the courtyard with a deafening crash, kicking up a thick cloud of dust and sand. In the confusion, Miller kicked backward, striking one of his captors in the knee and lunging for the other. It was the opening Jack needed. He threw the map piece into the air. As Vance's eyes instinctively followed it, Jack drew his Colt. The world exploded in a cacophony of wind and gunfire. Jack's shot went wide as he dove for the cover of a crumbling wall. Vance's men opened fire, their bullets chipping away at the ancient adobe. Miller, unarmed, scrambled into the relative safety of the chapel's nave. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse in the howling darkness of the storm. Jack moved through the ruins, a ghost in the gale, his old instincts taking over. The wind masked the sound of his footsteps, the swirling sand his movements. He took out one of Vance's men near the baptistery, a single clean shot through the blinding dust. The second man he caught reloading behind the shattered remains of the altar, and the fight was short and brutal. Now it was just him and Vance. "Come out, Callahan." Vance's voice taunted, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Face your reckoning. This is for Caleb. This is for his wife, Maria. This is for the son you made an orphan." The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Maria. He had never known her name. In the official report, she was just the wife, a casualty, collateral damage. For 5 years, he had let her remain nameless, a faceless ghost, to make the guilt more bearable. He found Miller huddled in a small sacristy, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "Get ready to run," Jack whispered, pressing the revolver he'd taken off one of the dead outlaws into the deputy's hands. "When you see your chance, you run for the horses, and you don't look back." The mission groaned again, a deep structural scream of protest against the storm. The roof of the chapel began to collapse. Jack emerged back into the main chapel, holding his hands up. "It's over, Vance. Your men are dead. This place is coming down on our heads." Vance stood in the main archway, silhouetted against the raging storm, his gun steady. "Not until your debt is paid in full." He stepped forward, and Jack saw the chilling truth. This elaborate 5-year quest for revenge, the tale of a lost silver mine, it was all a lie, a fabrication created by a grieving mind. "There is no silver mine, is there?" Jack said, the revelation hitting him with the force of a bullet. Vance laughed, a hollow, broken sound. Of course not. But the story was plausible enough. Your father and his kind were thieves. It was the perfect lure to draw you out, to isolate you, to make you confront the legacy of blood you inherited. He gestured around the collapsing mission. I wanted to destroy you in a place like this, a place where faith has died. I wanted you to feel what my brother felt. Helpless, hopeless, watching everything you value crumble around you. This was his true endgame. Not wealth, not even simple revenge. It was a twisted, grief-fueled quest for psychological destruction. He had spent 5 years constructing a fiction powerful enough to unearth Jack's past and drag him to this God-forsaken place for one final terrible confrontation. The bell in the tower above, loosened by the storm, began to toll, a frantic, discordant dirge. The ground shook. It's over, Jack said again, his voice filled with a weariness that went bone deep. He slowly lowered his hands, his gun still in its holster. He wasn't going to draw. Not this time. Vance raised his revolver, his eyes filled with a terrible, sorrowful fire. For Maria, he whispered. At that moment, a section of the bell tower gave way completely. A massive stone cross toppled from the roof, crashing down through the ceiling directly between the two men. The floor collapsed, swallowing the debris in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. Jack was thrown backward. Miller, seeing his chance, opened fire from the sacristy, providing the cover Jack needed. Through the dust, Jack saw Vance staggering, momentarily disoriented. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not with his gun, but with his body, tackling Vance, and sending them both tumbling through the archway and out into the relative safety of the courtyard as the rest of the chapel roof imploded behind them. The fight was a desperate, brutal thing, two men fueled by 5 years of grief and guilt trading blows in the heart of the storm. Finally, Jack gained the upper hand, pinning Vance to the ground, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. Vance's gun lay inches from his outstretched hand. Jack held him there, the wind whipping at them, the mission disintegrating around them. He could end it. He could press down, repay the violence, and close the book. But looking down into Silas Vance's hate-filled, broken eyes, he saw not a monster, but the reflection of his own ghost, a man consumed by a single tragic moment. He released the pressure. He picked up Vance's revolver and stood, his chest heaving. No more killing. Vance stared up at him, his face a mask of disbelief and defeated rage. Behind him, Deputy Miller emerged from the ruins, his gun trained on the downed man. The storm, as if its purpose had been served, began to subside. As the first rays of dawn pierced the breaking clouds, the wind died to a whisper, revealing the devastation. The San Agustin mission was a gutted ruin, a tombstone on the empty plains. Jack stood over the wreckage not as a triumphant hero, but as a somber survivor. Deputy Miller, his face streaked with grime, but his eyes clear and steady, kept a carbine leveled at the captive Silas Vance. Sheriff Brody arrived with a small posse an hour later, having ridden through the tail end of the storm. He took in the scene, the dead outlaws, the ruined mission, the captured mastermind, and looked at Jack, a universe of understanding in his tired gaze. "It's done then," Brody said, more a statement than a question. "It's done," Jack confirmed. There was no victory in his voice. He walked over to Brody, the weight of the last 5 years pressing down on him. "Brody, there are things you need to know. About why I left the Marshals. About that day." And there, in the quiet aftermath, with the rising sun illuminating the destruction, Jack Callahan finally confessed. He told Brody everything about the botched raid, the death of the innocent woman Maria, and the guilt that had driven him into self-imposed exile. He spoke of the silver locket and the lie he had allowed himself to believe. Brody listened without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When Jack was finished, the old sheriff simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "A man ain't defined by one mistake, Jack. He's defined by what he does afterward. You faced him. You didn't run. That's enough for me." Deputy Miller led a shackled Silas Vance away. The young lawman walked with a new confidence, the ordeal having forged his boyish enthusiasm into tempered steel. He met Jack's eye and gave a single respectful nod. The torch had been passed. Back in Redemption Gulch, the news of Vance's capture and the truth behind his reign of terror spread quickly. The people saw Jack not as the mythical Marshal Callahan, but as a flawed man who had confronted his own demons to save them. The fear that had strangled the town began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. That evening, Jack found Eliza in her clinic, cleaning a cut on Miller's forehead. She looked up as he entered, and a silent conversation passed between them. The ghost of her husband, the specter that had stood between them for so long, had finally been laid to rest. "It's over, Eliza," he said softly. "I know," she replied, her smile small but genuine. "Welcome back, Jack." It wasn't a promise of a future, but it was an acknowledgement of the present, a quiet reconciliation that felt more profound than any grand declaration. The threat of Vance was gone, but the scars on the town and on Jack remained. The law would deal with Silas Vance, but Jack knew his own penance was not yet complete. Among Vance's effects was the silver locket, the catalyst for so much pain. It didn't belong to him, and it didn't belong in an evidence locker. A week later, Jack rode out not west into the sunset, but north toward the mining town of Silver Creek. He found the address in the old territorial records, the last known residence of Maria Vance's widowed sister. He found her in a small, tidy cabin on the edge of town, a lonely woman with the same dark, sad eyes he remembered from her sister's face. He didn't give his name. He simply stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "I believe this belonged to your sister." He pressed the silver locket into her hand. She stared at it, her eyes filling with tears. She opened it, revealing the tiny, faded portraits within a smiling young woman and a serious-looking young man. Maria and Caleb. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the locket to her chest. "I thought it was lost forever." Jack tipped his hat, turned, and walked away without another word. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It was simply an act of atonement, a final, quiet closing of a chapter written in blood and regret. The ride back to Redemption Gulch felt different. The landscape no longer seemed hostile or empty. The sun on his back felt like a warmth, not a judgment. As he crested the familiar ridge overlooking the valley, he saw the town small but resolute, the sounds of hammers echoing as people rebuilt the registrar's office. They were rebuilding their lives. He spurred his horse forward, not riding away from his past, but toward a future he was finally ready to build.